June 9th, 2025. 7 to 12 a.m., a 42nd floor office on Park Avenue, Manhattan. Glass on 3 sides. A view of the Chrysler Building catching the early light. The doors unlocked. The lights are on a timer set weeks ago and never changed. A cleaning crew arriving on their normal Monday rotation finds the desks cleared, the filing cabinets empty, and a single monitor still logged into a trading dashboard nobody has touched in 2 days. The cleaner who finds it first, a woman who has worked that floor for 6 years and has never once seen the office look like this, checks the supply closet out of habit before she notices anything else is wrong. Because the first thing that registers isn't the empty desks, it's the silence. No keyboards. No one on a call in the glass-walled conference room where, most Mondays, at least one trader is already pacing and talking too loudly about overnight positions. She walks the floor once, twice before she calls her supervisor rather than security, because it still doesn't fully register as something worth an alarm. Just an unusually thorough weekend move, she assumes. Some client consolidation nobody told her about. 6 federal agents arriving 4 hours later with a warrant that took 11 months to assemble, climb out of 2 unmarked sedans on Park Avenue at 11:40 a.m., walk past a doorman who has no idea what's inside the elevator he's about to send them up in, and step off the 42nd floor into an office that looks, in the agent in charge's own words later entered into a report, less like a raid and more like a company that had simply stopped existing sometime over the weekend. They will find the same thing the cleaner did, a company that raised $340 million from investors and a founder who is nowhere in it. His name, for the purposes of this file, is Julian Voss, 46 years old. No formal finance degree, a fact his own marketing materials had somehow spun into a selling point, the outsider Wall Street couldn't teach. For 6 years, the fund he ran, marketed as a high-frequency algorithmic trading operation, delivered investors a return so consistent it became, inside a certain circle of Manhattan money managers, something close to a punchline about how good it was. 2.5% almost every single month, for 6 years straight, through a pandemic, through 2 market crashes, through a regional banking collapse that took out funds 20 times his size. Investors didn't call that skill. Toward the end, a small number of them started calling it something else, quietly to each other, in the specific tone people use when they suspect they already know an answer they don't want to say out loud. Before the story ends, you're going to see the actual paper, the fabricated audit letters, the trading logs generated after the fact rather than during it, that Julian Voss's team produced to keep the money flowing. You're going to see the exact statistical impossibility that first caught one regulator's attention, buried in a routine filing nobody else read closely. You're going to see the message his own head of compliance sent 11 months before the raid, warning him directly that the numbers didn't hold up, and what Voss did in response. And you're going to see exactly how a man under active federal investigation walked out of the country 48 hours before agents arrived to arrest him. This isn't a story about a genius algorithm. It's a story about how long a lie can survive if it's boring enough, consistent enough, and profitable enough that nobody with the power to stop it wants to be the one who asks. And about 4 separate people at 4 separate institutions who each did their job well enough to notice something was wrong and still weren't enough on their own to stop it. So how does a trading fund with no verifiable code, no independent custodian, and no outside auditor anyone had ever actually met keep $340 million flowing in for 6 straight years? It doesn't beat the market. It never touches the market at all. The fund launched quietly in 2019 under the name Meridian Quant Partners, with just under $4 million from 11 investors, mostly people Voss already knew personally, former colleagues from a mid-tier brokerage where he'd spent 9 unremarkable years as a retail broker before striking out on his own. His pitch in those early meetings was almost aggressively simple: a proprietary algorithm built by a small technical team he never named individually that exploited microsecond-level price discrepancies across exchanges. A real and legitimate trading strategy, one that dozens of legitimate firms genuinely run, which is precisely what made his version so hard to immediately dismiss. He showed early investors real trading statements from a real brokerage account, real returns, real and verifiable, for the first 14 months. That period wasn't the fraud. That period was the advertisement for it. Former colleagues who invested early described those first meetings less as a sales pitch than as a kind of quiet reassurance among peers. Voss never chased them, never pushed, sometimes gently suggesting a smaller initial investment than they'd offered, just to see how you feel about it after a quarter. One early investor, a former junior broker from the same firm who later cooperated with federal investigators, recalled Voss actually talking him out of doubling his position after 4 strong months, telling him, "Let's not get greedy, this isn't a casino." That restraint, replayed years later in an FBI interview room, is the detail that still visibly unsettles the people who trusted him most. Not that he lied, but how precisely he understood that the appearance of caution was worth more to him long-term than any single investor's larger check. Here's the mechanism, and it's worth being precise about it because Ponzi scheme is a phrase people use loosely without always understanding what actually has to happen for one to survive 6 years instead of 6 months. A classic Ponzi scheme collapses quickly because new investor money has to constantly outpace the returns being paid to old investors. And eventually the math simply runs out of room. Voss's version survived longer because of one specific decision made early on. He never promised outsized returns. 2.5% a month sounds almost modest compared to the wild claims that sink most Ponzi schemes within a year. Modest enough that it read as believable, sustainable, exactly the kind of number a genuinely skilled quantitative fund might actually produce. That restraint was the entire engineering of the fraud. By keeping the promised return low and boringly consistent, Voss kept the pool of new money required to sustain it small enough for years that the scheme could run far longer than the flashier frauds that tend to implode inside 18 months. There's a specific arithmetic to why that restraint mattered as much as it did. A fund promising 20% monthly returns needs a constant, accelerating flood of new capital just to cover what it owes existing investors. The kind of math that becomes visibly unsustainable within a year or two to anyone who bothers to run the numbers forward. A fund promising 2.5% needs only a slow, steady trickle of new money, the kind that a modest, word-of-mouth reputation among a small circle of former colleagues could realistically sustain almost indefinitely. Voss wasn't running a faster version of a Ponzi scheme. He was running the slowest, most patient version anyone investigating the case had ever encountered. One built, according to the eventual complaint, to be sustainable for as long as he needed it to be, right up until the exact week the math finally, quietly, ran out of room. The paper trail behind those returns was manufactured almost entirely in-house. Voss employed a small back-office team, 4 people at its peak, according to former employees who later cooperated with investigators, whose actual, if unstated, job was producing monthly statements that matched the promised 2.5%, adjusted with just enough month-to-month variance to look organic rather than engineered. There was no algorithm executing real trades at the volume the marketing materials described. There was, according to the eventual federal complaint, a spreadsheet. One of those back-office employees, a woman hired originally as a client reporting associate with no trading background at all, later testified that she understood, roughly 18 months into the job, that the reconciliation adjustments she was asked to make each month bore no real relationship to any trade she could independently verify, but that Voss framed the work consistently and convincingly as smoothing over legitimate timing discrepancies between the fund's internal systems and its external statements, a kind of technical housekeeping rather than fabrication. She described continuing the work for nearly 3 more years, partly out of genuine uncertainty about what she was actually looking at, and partly, in her own words, because he was so calm about all of it that it felt more paranoid to question it than to just keep doing my job. Before the story goes further, the trailer for what's coming. You're going to see the exact filing that first caught a regulator's eye. 3 sentences buried on page 40 of a routine report. You're going to see the compliance officer's warning email still preserved in full that Voss chose to ignore rather than investigate. You're going to see the bank that should have caught this years earlier, and the reason it didn't. And you're going to see the specific 48-hour window in which a man already under federal scrutiny managed to disappear entirely in an era when disappearing is supposed to be nearly impossible. The first crack came from an unlikely and almost accidental place, a junior analyst at the Securities and Exchange Commission, running a routine statistical screen across a batch of mid-sized fund filings. not investigating Meridian specifically, not looking for fraud at all, simply cross-referencing reported monthly returns against each fund's stated trading volume, flagged Meridian's filing for what she described in her own internal notes as returns with essentially zero standard deviation across 71 consecutive months. Real trading strategies, even excellent ones, have bad months. Meridian's spreadsheet did not. The analyst's note, later entered into evidence, read simply, "Either this is the best fund in America, or this isn't a fund at all." Her supervisor, reviewing the flag alongside dozens of others that week, didn't dismiss it, but didn't prioritize it either, filing it into a queue of further review cases that, at the SEC's chronic staffing levels, sometimes sit for a year or more before anyone opens them again. That analyst, in a later interview given anonymously to a financial journalist, described the specific frustration of watching a flag she knew was significant. Simply age inside a system built to handle volume, not urgency. Comparing it to seeing a fire alarm go off in a building where the fire department only has one truck for 40 buildings, and yours isn't on fire yet, just smoking a little. She had at the time no way of knowing that 11 months of that queue represented 11 more months of new investors, including Arthur Feld's neighbor, wiring money into an account that a statistical model in her own office had already, quietly, identified as almost certainly fraudulent. That's the first name on the board in a sense. The regulator that had the exact evidence needed to stop this, sitting in a queue for 11 months, while Meridian kept raising money. The second name on the board is Meridian's own auditor, or rather, the absence of one that mattered. Voss's fund technically retained an outside accounting firm, a real one with a real name investors could look up, which satisfied the box most retail investors check before wiring money. What that firm actually audited, according to testimony later given by one of its own junior accountants, was never the trading activity itself. It was the monthly statements Voss's in-house team produced, cross-checked for internal consistency rather than verified against any independent trading record. The auditor wasn't complicit. It was simply reviewing the wrong document thoroughly and honestly for 6 straight years, because nobody with the authority to demand better records ever did. The third name on the board very nearly ended this story 2 years earlier than it actually did. Meridian's own head of compliance, hired ironically specifically to satisfy investor due diligence requests for an independent compliance function, began in early 2023 cross-referencing the fund's reported trade volume against the actual capacity of the prime brokerage account Meridian used to execute trades. The numbers didn't fit, not by a small margin. Meridian's statements claimed trading volume roughly 40 times larger than anything that account could have physically processed. She sent Voss a 2-page memo laying this out in plain, careful language, ending with a single line preserved verbatim in the eventual federal complaint. "I need you to walk me through this personally, or I need to escalate it." Voss's response, according to the same complaint, was to schedule the meeting, hold it, explain the discrepancy as a reporting lag between our clearing systems, and then within 3 weeks quietly restructure her role so that her access to the fund's trading data was routed through a new intermediate approval layer. One final signature, always his own. That sat between her and anything she wanted to independently verify from that point forward. She would later describe that meeting to investigators in granular detail, how Voss had listened to her entire 2-page memo without interrupting, nodded slowly at several points as though genuinely absorbing a technical concern, and responded not with anger or evasion, but with what she called the most reasonable-sounding explanation I've ever heard for something that turned out to be completely made up. He'd sketched a rough diagram on a whiteboard, walked her through a plausible-sounding clearing system lag, thanked her specifically for exactly the kind of scrutiny this fund needs, and scheduled a follow-up meeting for 6 weeks later that, in practice, never actually happened. Quietly absorbed into a reorganization she didn't fully register as retaliation until she was looking back at it, years later, from an FBI conference room. So ask the question that would eventually occupy federal investigators for 11 months and every defrauded investor for the rest of their lives. How does one man keep an entire compliance function, an outside auditor, and a market regulator all technically doing their jobs and still walk away with $340 million? The fourth name on the board is the bank. Meridian's prime brokerage relationship sat with a mid-sized institutional bank that, under federal anti-money laundering rules, was required to monitor account activity for exactly the kind of volume mismatch the compliance officer had already flagged internally. A junior compliance analyst at the bank did, in fact, notice a similar discrepancy in late 2024. The reported trading activity on client marketing materials simply didn't match transaction volume moving through the account, and filed an internal suspicious activity report. That report, under federal law, cannot be shared with the customer, meaning Voss never knew it existed. It also, due to a backlog later cited in a congressional inquiry into the bank's compliance staffing, sat unreviewed by federal regulators for 9 months before anyone cross-referenced it against the SEC's own 11-month-old queued flag on the same fund. The analyst who filed that report, according to testimony later given as part of the congressional inquiry, described being told by a supervisor at the time that the volume mismatch on its own wasn't necessarily unusual for smaller quant shops that route a portion of execution through third-party venues. A plausible-sounding explanation that, in hindsight, mirrored almost exactly the language Voss himself had used to explain the same discrepancy to his own compliance officer 2 years earlier, as though the entire financial system had independently arrived at the same convenient, unverified assumption. The report was filed correctly, exactly as the law required. It simply joined a stack of hundreds of similar reports the bank generates in an average month, most of which statistically turn out to be nothing. 4 institutions, 4 separate, technically correct procedures, 4 moments where the fraud could have ended 2, 3, even 4 years earlier than it did. And didn't, not through any single dramatic failure, but through the accumulated weight of everyone doing their specific, narrow job competently while nobody owned the full picture. It was the collision of the SEC's queued flag and the bank's suspicious activity report, finally cross-referenced by a supervisor doing a quarterly backlog review, that triggered the formal joint investigation in July of 2024. The supervisor who made that connection, according to internal records later summarized in the congressional inquiry, wasn't specifically assigned to either case. She was conducting a routine audit of unresolved flags older than 6 months across both agencies' shared referral system, a process that exists precisely to catch this kind of collision but runs, by design, only once a quarter. She has since described the moment of connecting the 2 documents as almost anticlimactic. 2 separate, unremarkable-looking flags, filed 9 months apart by people who never spoke to each other, that together took less than an hour to read as unmistakable evidence of a 6-year fraud. From that point, building an actual criminal case took 11 more months. Subpoenaing records, deposing former employees, reconstructing 6 years of fabricated statements against real bank transaction data to prove, transaction by transaction, exactly how little of the claimed trading had ever occurred. Voss, according to the federal complaint, learned the investigation had formally opened roughly 4 months before the raid. Not through any leak, but because his own attorney, retained for what he described to Voss as routine regulatory inquiry preparedness, received an initial document request broad enough to make clear this was not routine. What Voss did with those 4 months is, in its own way, as carefully engineered as the fraud itself. He didn't flee immediately, which investigators believe would have triggered exactly the kind of urgent asset freeze that immediate flight tends to provoke. Instead, he spent the months slowly, unremarkably converting fund assets into diversified, harder-to-trace holdings, informed a small circle of family that he was considering an extended sabbatical abroad for his health, and quietly closed Meridian's lease 6 weeks before the raid under the stated reason of downsizing during a strategic review. He kept showing up to a handful of investor calls during that stretch, according to 2 investors who spoke with him directly in April of that year, sounding, by their account, exactly as calm and unhurried as he always had, reassuring one of them, almost gently, that markets get choppy sometimes. That's when the algorithm actually earns its fee. Neither investor had any reason, at the time, to hear that as anything other than the same steady confidence that had kept them invested for years. 48 hours before 6 federal agents arrived with a warrant, Voss boarded a commercial flight under his own legal name, no fake identity required, because nothing yet prevented him from traveling, to a country with no active extradition treaty being enforced with the United States at the time. He checked one bag, He did not say goodbye to the back office employee who had spent 3 years producing his statements and has, according to people who knew her, never contacted her since. As of this recording, his exact location is known to investigators but has not been made public, and no timeline for extradition proceedings has been confirmed. None of this erases what it cost the people who trusted him. A man in New Jersey, call him Arthur Feld for this file, 68 years old, a retired high school physics teacher, moved almost his entire retirement account, just under $900,000, into Meridian in 2021, drawn specifically by the fund's modest, boringly consistent returns, the exact quality that had made it believable in the first place. He and his wife had planned to use that money to help their daughter with a down payment and to cover 2 decades of retirement travel they'd been deferring since his teaching days. He learned the fund was frozen pending investigation from a 2-paragraph email forwarded to hundreds of investors simultaneously that used the phrase irregularities in reported trading activity without using the word fraud even once. Feld read that email standing in his kitchen on a Tuesday morning, he later told a reporter, and reread it 4 times before he fully understood what it meant. Because the language was careful enough that his first instinct was to assume it was some kind of temporary technical hold rather than the end of his retirement. He called the fund's investor line that same morning and reached a recorded message. He called again that afternoon. By the following week, the number had been disconnected entirely. He has since had to postpone his daughter's down payment indefinitely and returned briefly to substitute teaching at 68 to cover the gap. Standing in front of a 10th grade physics class again, he said, teaching the exact same unit on statistical probability that, had he understood it as well as the SEC analyst who eventually flagged Meridian's filing, might have told him years earlier that a return with 0 variance across 71 months wasn't a sign of skill at all. He has said in a statement given to investigators that the thing he can't stop replaying isn't the number. It's a lunch 18 months before the collapse, where he'd asked Voss directly, half joking, "What's the catch?" And Voss had laughed the exact same easy laugh he always used and said there wasn't one. Among the roughly 900 investors who lost money in Meridian, the reaction has split in a way that mirrors almost every fraud case of this size. A portion of them, including several former colleagues who invested in that first quiet round in 2019, still describe Voss, even now, with a strange residual warmth. Recalling specifically his instinct to caution them against over-investing, the detail that made the fraud so much harder to see coming than a more obviously greedy one would have been. A larger portion, including Arthur Feld, described that same restraint now as the cruelest part of the entire scheme, proof, in their eyes, that Voss understood exactly what he was building and disciplined himself for 6 years specifically to keep it running as long as possible at their expense. And that's really the uncomfortable center of this whole case. Julian Voss built something that, for the first 14 months, was genuinely real. A legitimate strategy, real returns, real proof that could survive scrutiny. What he chose to do afterward, when the real version couldn't scale fast enough to match what he'd promised, is the actual crime. Not a moment of desperation, but 6 years of sustained, patient, carefully restrained fabrication, precisely disciplined enough to avoid the greed that usually gives fraud like this away. He is not a criminal who got lucky. He is, by every available account, unusually good at exactly one thing: understanding, better than the regulators built to catch him, exactly how boring a lie has to be to survive. This case made it to the channel. Not everyone does. Some files never leave the vault. The ones still under active investigation, the ones where extradition proceedings are ongoing and premature detail could compromise them. If you want those, the link's in the description. So, who actually failed Arthur Feld here? The man who lied to him at that lunch for 18 months? Or the 4 separate institutions that each had a piece of the truth years before the raid and never once put those pieces in the same room? Leave your answer below. Half of you are already about to disagree with the other half. And it's worth sitting with the fact that both answers can be true without canceling each other out. Because somewhere right now, in a country with no active extradition arrangement, Julian Voss is still, as far as anyone can confirm, a free man, and the exact same restraint that let his fraud survive 6 years is very likely the same restraint some other fund manager, promising some other boringly reasonable return, is relying on at this exact moment. And if you want to see the case where the fraud wasn't hidden in a spreadsheet at all, but in a single number nobody thought to double check, that story is waiting right here.